It wasn't an accident. Poland is absolutely convinced that the incursion of at least 19 drones into its airspace during the early hours of Tuesday, September 9th, was no accident. It wasn't a technical glitch or anything like that. No matter how much Russia tries to play innocent now, it was entirely deliberate. Precisely under the assumption that this was a deliberate provocation, and in order to investigate it deeply, Poland has mobilized its territorial defense force, along with 12,000 personnel from the police, border guard, and fire services. The goal? To find the remains of the drones that went down. And so far, they've already found debris from at least 15 different drones, almost confirming both the figures and the scale of the Russian aggression we've seen. And with those figures in mind, Poland and NATO are in full agreement. This was Russia testing the alliance. A multi-hour incursion carried out overnight, right in the middle of a bloody airstrike against Ukraine. An attack involving over 400 drones and more than 40 cruise missiles, hitting at least 17 different locations across the country, especially in the western region. But what had never been seen before was a drone incursion of this scale into actual NATO territory. And let's not forget, at least 8 of the drones that entered Poland were Shahed drones, the Iranian-made models that Vladimir Putin loves to use to spread terror across Ukraine. These drones are 3.5 meters long and can carry a warhead of up to 50 kilograms. Enough to level a small building in a single strike. This is no joke. And in fact, many European allies are now seriously concerned about the state of air security across Europe, because something like this could happen again at any moment.
Russian drones in Poland's airspace stir worries for Europe's civil aviation.
The general consensus, and something most European military experts agree on, is that Putin knew exactly what he was doing, and most Poles are crystal clear about it. This is not a declaration of war, but it is yet another provocation from the Kremlin meant to send a message. What message? That supporting Ukraine comes at a cost. That according to Moscow, playing with fire could get you burned. And make no mistake, Poland is not the only target here. What Russia wants is to give ammunition to those in Europe who are growing tired of the war and want to close this chapter as soon as possible, even if that means accepting Putin's terms. The problem, if NATO doesn't respond with strength, the message that will echo in Warsaw is deeply unsettling. Can we really count on our allies? And that's no small question in Poland, a country where history has burned in this exact way before. There's a lesson etched into national memory: show weakness and Russia advances, but stand your ground and they think twice. So, is Russia trying to intimidate NATO? All signs point to yes. And not just the alliance as a whole, but its most exposed members: Poland, the Baltic states, Romania. In short, all the countries Russia still dreams of reclaiming into its former sphere of influence.
This is an act of aggression that posed a real threat to the safety of our citizens.
The move is clear. By threatening to bring the conflict all the way to Poland, the Kremlin isn't just trying to spread fear. It wants the West to back down, to accept that Ukraine is Putin's business now, and that its territory no longer deserves protection, solidarity, or anything at all. But here's the warning. If Europe hands over Ukraine, that won't be the end of the game. It'll just be the beginning. Because for Putin, controlling Ukraine isn't the goal, but the launch pad. Now for the good news. This time, NATO didn't just sit on its hands. It responded with military muscle and political reflexes. So, how exactly? Well, with Polish and Dutch fighter jets, German Patriot missile systems, Italian aerial surveillance, all coordinated to protect Allied skies. And not just that, Poland triggered Article 4, the one that forces all member states to sit down, talk, and decide collectively. And keep this in mind, that article is so exceptional, it's only been invoked 6 times in the 76-year history of NATO. Now, what exactly is this Article 4? Well, here's the deal. It allows any member state that feels threatened to call an emergency meeting with the rest of the alliance to seek joint solutions. We'll dive deeper into this in a moment. But the point is that this time the signal was loud and clear. If Russia wanted to divide the alliance, it got the exact opposite. Now, I'm sure many of you are wondering, and it's a very important question, what has Russia said about all this? Well, so far, very little, and they're dodging responsibility. For instance, the current chargé d'affaires at the Russian embassy in Poland has claimed that it's false that Russian drones entered Polish airspace. The problem is, there's no doubt whatsoever about what actually happened. But hey, that's how the Russians are.
It is unlikely that Russian drones accidentally entered Polish airspace.
Alright, up to this point we've talked about what happened. But now comes the real question. The big question that we need to ask ourselves. The one that makes all of this so important. Why on earth would the Russians want to provoke Poland like this? Why might this be more than just an accident? What are they trying to achieve in Moscow? Well, this is VisualPolitik. And here on the team, we've asked ourselves those very questions. We've rolled up our sleeves, dug into it, and here are the 3 key takeaways. The 3 clues that tell us what Moscow might really be after with this bizarre move of launching a bunch of military drones at one of the most security-conscious countries in all of Europe. Targeting the Hawk was no coincidence. This was not an accident. It was a carefully calculated move by Moscow. So here they are, the 3 possible objectives the Kremlin might be pursuing. This is a very common strategy in how the Russians negotiate. They always aim for maximalist positions, create a high-stress environment, and push everyone to the edge, so that in the end, the conclusion is, it's better to strike a bad deal than to risk an all-out confrontation. And again, this is nothing new. It's a well-known tactic. In fact, it's something Kaja Kallas, the EU's High Representative for Foreign Affairs, explicitly warned Donald Trump about right after he won the election. With the Russians, constructive, good-faith negotiations don't exist. So from this point of view, launching a wave of drones against Poland and forcing fighter jets to scramble is a clear way of applying pressure. It's a way to stress everyone out, so that in the end, the idea of Ukraine giving in a bit too much just to bring the whole thing to an end doesn't sound so bad. And don't forget, right now, we're in the middle of a negotiation process, one that the Poles themselves view with a lot of skepticism. And take note of this warning that Polish historian Marek Budzij gave us back in July. He's a well-known Polish historian and journalist, and in his youth, he was also a prominent anti-communist activist, you know, back when Poland was still one of the Soviet Union's satellite states. And here's what he said, as far back as July.
Ukrainians report that SIM cards from Poland and Lithuania have been discovered in downed Russian attack drones. In their view, this could suggest preparations to test strike corridors into both countries, since it's well known that they use telecom networks to correct the flight path of the drones.
So, back in July, the Russians were already experimenting with connecting their drones to Poland's and Lithuania's telecom networks. Then, in August, we saw isolated incidents of drones violating Polish airspace, like test runs. And finally, now in September, bam! One of the biggest provocations ever on NATO territory. Just 2 months after the Russians began trying to link, I repeat, the operation of their drones to Poland's telecom infrastructure. And what was going on in July? Well, right around that time, the White House was ramping up pressure on the Kremlin to secure some kind of concession. In fact, it was in July when Trump issued that ultimatum to Russia, which ultimately led nowhere. So it looks like Moscow was already preparing for the possibility that negotiations would begin, and they wanted tools in hand to crank up the pressure. And in that same vein, this drone operation gives the Russians another advantage, changing the public narrative. It reminds Europeans, and especially Poles, that the war isn't over, and that Russia isn't retreating, just as people in those countries are growing tired of the whole mess. It's the same logic behind their increasingly aggressive punitive strikes across western Ukraine, and the lifting of many of the limitations they had previously observed. For example, we're now seeing a sharp uptick in missile attacks on Kyiv, raising tensions to force concessions. Not feeling so random anymore, is it? Coming up on September 12th, less than 72 hours after the drone strike, Russia and Belarus are kicking off major joint military exercises, the Zapad 2025 drills. And of course, NATO sees the pattern. If you're going to run military exercises that prepare you for a potential confrontation, testing your adversary's defense and surveillance systems makes perfect sense. It increases the value of those drills. And that could very well be another objective here, to test, probe, and analyze NATO's air defense systems, especially Poland's, which is quickly becoming one of Europe's military powerhouses, arguably the largest land and air military force in the entire EU. In fact, the drone flight paths seem to have followed routes close to key communication networks and critical air defense systems, the kind that would matter most in the event of actual conflict. So, to put it plainly, this may have been a clear reconnaissance mission, but we're still not done. Donald Trump doesn't want trouble with Moscow. He's not thrilled about Europe, and he wants to put an end to the war in Ukraine. We all know that, and we also know that his plan is going from bad to worse. And yet, just a few days ago, Polish President Karol Nawrocki visited the White House. He's only recently taken office, and he won the election with a slogan that might sound familiar: Poland first, Poles first. Now, here's the thing. Poland is something of a unicorn in Europe, and for the United States. It's probably the closest US ally in all of Europe. Warsaw has spent years cultivating its Atlantic partnership, to the point that its diplomatic delegation in DC isn't just a political office, it's practically a corporation, with hundreds of staff working day and night to win over American politicians and business leaders. And maybe because of that, despite all his warnings to Europe, and even after recently announcing that he would scale back the US military presence in the Baltics, Trump said just days ago that he'd make an exception for Poland. He would keep US troops in the country and support Warsaw to the very end. He even floated the idea of increasing their presence there.
If anything, we'll put more there, if they want. They've long wanted a larger presence.
Which is exactly the opposite of what's happening in the rest of the European continent.
U.S. to cut military aid for Baltic states. Estonia's defense minister Hanno Pevkur said the U.S. move is especially symbolic, in a negative way.
So it's crystal clear that this strong US commitment to Poland hasn't gone down well in Moscow. And how did they respond? By putting Washington in a tight spot. Because the fact that the US president had to monitor operations from the Situation Room while F-35s were being deployed, that's a public display that Trump's plan is failing. And not only that, it's also a warning that this commitment could turn into a major headache. Exactly the kind of thing Trump wants to avoid at all costs. What's more, these actions could push NATO to invoke NATO's Article 4. So, what does that article say? Well, essentially, that any member country can request the alliance to meet and take collective action if they feel their territorial integrity or security is under threat. And what would that achieve? It could test the cohesion of an alliance where many countries, starting with the US, are already fed up with the whole situation. So there you have it, the three likely goals behind Moscow's actions: shift the narrative and crank up the pressure to extract concessions in negotiations, test NATO's surveillance and air defense systems to boost their own military capabilities, and punish the US-Poland alliance while testing NATO's supposed unity. That's why most experts and military analysts agree. This is definitely not a random accident. This was a planned operation, and it's likely not the last one. It's straight out of the Kremlin's political playbook. The real problem, and let's not kid ourselves, is that all of this makes one thing painfully clear. The West's deterrence capability over Moscow is looking pretty weak, but that's a topic for another day. For now, the real question is, how do you think NATO should respond? What do you believe Moscow is really aiming for with all these provocations? And how will Poland react? Let us know what you think in the comments. And if you found this video interesting, don't forget to give it a like and subscribe to VisualPolitik if you haven't done so already. Thank you so very much for watching. I'll see you next time.